Hey guys, so today we're going to be having a discussion about native speakers and language learners and heritage speakers, and we're going to get into the difference between each of these different types of speakers and the advantages of, say, being a native speaker or being a heritage speaker or language learner, whatever it is, because in each one of these categories there are different areas of language learning or speaking or other skills, reading, writing, that will come more easily to you if you are, say, a native speaker or a language learner or a heritage speaker. So we're going to go over some of those and really get into what it means to be a native speaker or a language learner or a heritage speaker and how you can learn from these different types of speakers. But before we get started, I would like to do a quick shout out to one of you guys, to Marie, whose friend reached out to me recently and let me know about your situation that you are going through right now and how you recently had your left leg amputated because of a terrible accident. And I just wanted to let you know that you have so much support and that I am so glad to hear that you are recovering and that you are doing well and that you will be getting a prosthetic leg this summer. And I have a feeling that you will come out of this so strong, and I can only imagine what it's like going through this, but I know that every time we encounter some kind of challenge or obstacle in life, and when we overcome it, we are so much stronger for it, and we learn from it and we adapt, and you've got this. You're gonna get through this and you're going to overcome it, and you are going to be a stronger person for it. All right, I hope that your recovery continues to go well, and I wish you the best. Alright, so let's continue with native speakers, language learners, and heritage speakers. So we're basically just going to go over each one of these so we can get a very clear idea of what they are, and then we're going to compare them and really get deep into it. So a native speaker, I'm sure many of you guys have heard of native speakers and that you've probably been told, practice with native speakers, learn from native speakers, get with as many native speakers as you can. Yes, it is a great way to improve your language by practicing with native speakers. Of course, they know the language very naturally, but it's also important to keep in mind who you are practicing with. So if you're looking for a native speaker to practice with, and let's say that you learn from someone who has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in that language, for example, that person is going to be a little bit more well-versed in the language structure and grammar and rules and all that than, say, someone who is, I don't know, a high school dropout or whatever it is. And that's not to say that you can't learn from someone who has a different educational background. You don't have to graduate from high school to be educated. That is only an example. Many people are self-educated. But the point is that just because someone is a native speaker doesn't mean that you want to speak the way that they do. So we'll come back to this after we go over heritage speakers and language learners. So a heritage speaker is very similar to a native speaker, but the main difference is that a heritage speaker usually doesn't study, like go to school in that language or even live in a country that primarily speaks that language. So an example of this might be like in the United States, or specifically here in California where I live, we have many heritage Spanish speakers who are kind of native speakers. Like, this is basically a subcategory of native speakers, but they are not all that comfortable. Many of them, of course, there are some heritage speakers who do practice this, and we're not generalizing because every situation is different and everyone is going to have a different level, as some will be higher and lower, and this is just an overview of what a heritage speaker might be. So heritage speakers, for example, here in California, we have high school classes for these heritage speakers because they're learning Spanish as their language. Like they speak it at home and they speak it with their family members, but they haven't learned it in school. So they haven't learned to read and write in that language, but they can speak it, but they don't speak it as fluently as they would like to, or as a native speaker who, say, lives in Spain or in Guatemala or Argentina or wherever it is. So here we have those classes where they can go and they can learn the writing and reading, but it's different than being a language learner because they do already have a significant knowledge of that language, and especially of the culture, and they have speaking practice and they know a lot already, and they are bilingual. They just have usually a dominance in speaking over reading and writing. Alright, so now let's get into language learners. So language learners are, of course, people who are learning the language. So if you're learning a second language or third language or whatever it is, then you're considered a language learner. Sounds pretty straightforward, but there is quite a bit of overlap within these. So if we look at the language learners and the native speakers and the heritage speakers, we would actually see some overlap. And really, like I said, a heritage speaker is a native speaker. And both of those are language learners, because even if it's your first language, you're still a language learner. So myself, as an example, I'm a native English speaker, and I speak Spanish as a second language and French as a third language. But I'm a learner in all three of those languages, because even though I speak English as my first language and I've gone to school in that language all my life, there are still areas where I can improve. And there's just always more, especially if you get into like vocabulary specific to a particular field. So if you get into that jargon, then you're going to have vocabulary that you don't know, like in the medical field or the business field. So there's always something more. And I chose those two examples because those are areas that I haven't studied much. So there's always more as far as vocabulary, and there's also always more as far as grammar. Well, there is more for me, there's more. We look at English specifically. Like, I teach English, I have taught English at least, to native speakers and to language learners, but I really haven't taught English learners from the very beginning a lot. So even though I speak English and it's my native language, I don't necessarily know English the way that I know Spanish. And I teach Spanish from the very beginning because I know it all the way through, like beginning to intermediate to advanced. I know all the stages to learning that language. But if I were to go to English and have to teach someone, I would have to do a lot of work, a lot of research and learning on my part to be able to teach that as a second language, because I don't know it. I'm a native English speaker, but I don't know the structure of the language the way that I would need to know it to teach it as a second language. So I don't know necessarily exactly how every English verb is conjugated, because I learned it through growing up, through immersion as a child, and I didn't learn it through grammar like I learned Spanish. So this is a huge difference between language learners and native speakers. And it is not to say that native speakers cannot have that knowledge. Many of them do, especially teachers, if they teach that language. Native English teachers who teach English from the very beginning like that, they go back through and they learn that, and then they have that knowledge. So any knowledge can be gained, but that is a primary difference between native speakers and language learners. Language learners typically have a very strong foundation in grammar because that's how they learn the language, whereas native speakers are typically very fluent and they speak the language very naturally. You know, they have slang and it sounds native-like because it is. And those are characteristics of native and language learners, but that's not to say that each of those people, the learners and the native speakers, cannot gain the skills that the other has. It just requires more work in that area, and it's important to recognize, because then you know, oh, I'm a native speaker, I need to practice these skills that language learners have. Or I'm a language learner, I need to practice the skills that native speakers have. And you might not need these skills for everyone. If you don't plan to be a teacher that in your native language, then you don't necessarily need to know the grammatical structure of the verb conjugations and how to teach it as a second language. You only need to know that if you are doing it, if you are teaching it as a second language, or if you just have an interest in doing it. Anyway, I hope that gives you a pretty good idea of the difference between native speakers and language learners. And then if we look at heritage speakers, they really fall into both categories because they've got that native ability to speak, and they have the colloquialisms and all of that in their language and their speaking and the culture, and those are really the aspects of the native speaker. But when they go to school to learn the language, then they're language learners. So they go to school and they are learning to read and write and in that language and to improve their communication. But it's different than just learning it as a language learner, because they're not going through and learning it step by step by step through the verbs and the grammar and all of that. They are specifically looking at the written format of the language. So, language, I could talk about language for hours, you guys, but language itself is oral. Language is not written. The spoken language developed before writing. A writing system is altogether separate from spoken language. So when we learn that as a way to record our language, we're practicing an entirely different ability, and yes, they are related, but you can have the ability to do one without the other. Anyway, let's focus back on our main topic here. So to wrap up, what I want you guys to really take away from this is that there are many, many, many different speakers and levels and abilities, and we have these categories, native and learner and heritage, but where you fall in that, it's not necessarily just one category. There's a range, and you can be anywhere on that spectrum of being any one of those three. And even if you fall into one of those, it doesn't mean that you are not also learning the other categories. So really don't focus too much on the categories and just focus on what you need to improve in your abilities, because that's what's going to help you the most. So if your goal is to learn a language, then like mine is right now is learning Spanish primarily. I'm learning French as my third language. So my goal with that is I'm practicing Spanish and I'm practicing French, but I'm not practicing English, even though I could improve because I'm happy with my ability. That doesn't mean that I couldn't improve. So there's just always going to be room for improvement. Remember that no matter how much you learn, you can always learn more. The only time when you are going to stop learning is when you just give up on it and you decide that you have enough, and that's fine if you decide you're done, but don't decide you're done because you think that you know everything. There's always going to be more. All right? And there, of course, is always going to be more videos with me. You guys check back here on Monday and Thursday for my regular uploading schedule. And don't forget to like and share this video to show your support for Marie. And I will see you guys back here next time. Ciao.